evening. So if they had gone immediately back to New Orleans after this visit, which they would have had to do in order for Oswald to pick up his check the next morning in New Orleans, that means they were lying with seemingly no purpose to Sylvia Odio, or they changed their mind for some unknown reason. But they claimed that they would not leave Dallas until the next morning or later. So 9/24 or 9/25. The other date is 9/25. The other possible date. 9/25 would be possible if Oswald went with the two Cubans to Dallas after picking up his unemployment check. Another mystery is that a woman in Houston, Mrs. Estelle Twyford, said that Oswald called her on the evening of September the 25th at her Houston home asking for her husband, a contact of Oswald's who had helped send Oswald some socialist literature. Oswald said that he wanted to talk to the husband for several hours, presumably while waiting for the 2:30 a.m. bus to leave. Mrs. Twyford assumed that that meant that Oswald was making a local call in Houston, because he could not speak for hours on a long-distance call. And then the call sounded sonically so clear that it sounded like a local call to her. Her husband was not at home and didn't come home until the weekend. He was out of town on business. Oswald could have made that call if he traveled from New Orleans to Houston the morning or early afternoon of September the 25th, and then got to Houston late on September 25th, because Mrs. Twyford said the call came between 7:30 p.m. and 10 o'clock p.m. There would have been enough time. But again, no receipt of his ticket from New Orleans was ever found, nor was he seen on a bus from New Orleans to Houston. What about September the 25th? Well, actually, a September 25th visit has even more problems. Oswald could have gotten to Houston by bus from Dallas between 9 o'clock p.m. and 2:30 a.m. the next morning. But the Cubans were still in Dallas. Oswald would then have had to call the Houstonian, Mrs. Twyford, long distance, and it would have made no sense for him to say he wanted to talk to Twyford for hours. What if Twyford had been home? How could Oswald have talked for hours when he was on a layover, presumably, along the road to Houston, but far from Houston? He would not have gotten to Houston until very close to 2:30 a.m., and Mrs. Twyford said he called between 7:30 p.m. and 10 o'clock p.m. So these logistics make a visit in Dallas on the evening of September 25th very problematic. How could Oswald be in Dallas on September 25th, the evening, if he was calling Mrs. Twyford? Oswald simply could not have gotten to Houston before 10 o'clock p.m. after a 9 o'clock p.m. visit to Odio on September 25th. Again, Oswald called a Houstonian by phone one evening that week, and it was likely a local call. It could not have been a local call on September 25th if he was in Dallas that evening. In this map, you can see that Oswald and the Cubans could have driven up to Shreveport and then over to Dallas. And then after the meeting with Odio around 9:30, they could have taken Oswald down to Houston and dropped him off at the bus station there, and then driven over to New Orleans, which is a straight shot from Houston, without any difficulty at all. So there is some speculation that maybe Oswald convinced the Cubans to drive him to Houston, and then they returned to New Orleans. The red arrow here indicates that Oswald then went on by bus to the border. But this is sheer speculation. Why does Bugliosi believe that Odio was correct on both counts? That is, his three men visited her sometime at the end of September, and one of them was Oswald. Well, it's a fact that Oswald's whereabouts between early September 25th and 2:35 a.m. September 26th are unknown. It's also a fact that no one saw Oswald on a bus from New Orleans from 12:30 p.m. to Houston at 10:50 p.m., where the Warren Commission believed he was. Again, in all of the other bus links to Mexico that Oswald was on, travelers remembered seeing him. Bugliosi and Gene Davison think that this is circumstantial evidence that indeed Oswald was Leon Oswald and he was in Dallas. I am skeptical. I remind you that even Bugliosi describes all this evidence as failing to rise to evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. He was a trial lawyer. Why wouldn't he use that as a standard of proof to rely on in this case? If he did, he would discredit this whole allegation because it's based on the memory of two people, and one of them, seeing a psychiatrist, was considered by some people to be quite excitable and emotional. The bottom line is that the Odio story has never been, and may never be, proven or disproven. And so the question then must be, what do we do with this state of affairs? This is the fact, and anything else we say, positive or negative, about the possibility that Oswald was there is not a fact. But it is a fact that it's never been proven or disproven, and it probably never will. So what do we do? The Warren Commission concluded that Odio met with three men, but that there was no evidence that the man she honestly thought was Oswald actually was. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was unable to reach firm conclusions as to the meaning or significance of the Odio incident to the president's assassination, which is very important because it should remind us that even if Oswald was there, it may not be the smoking gun that some people claim it is. There are two consistent conclusions that we can make. One possible conclusion is that in the absence of likelihood either way, the Odio story must simply be disregarded. Since we can't prove it or disprove it, it's actually a big, somewhat interesting nothing. We cannot move in any direction on its basis. We are left in the same position as if three men visited with Odio, and Odio never said that she thought Oswald was one of them. That is, no inferences at all can be drawn from it. I happen to agree with this conclusion. As an historian myself, I think that this is what the vast majority of historians would conclude. And I think most historians have concluded this way because they have ignored this story, essentially concluding that it is of no significance. But there's another conclusion we can draw, and that is, suppose Oswald was one of the three visitors, actually, and Odio was correct. Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose he was there, Odio was correct. It still may hardly have mattered. Why? We know Oswald had an inclination to infiltrate pro-Castro groups, as with Carlos Bringuer. That is, there was an incident in 1963 in New Orleans when Oswald pretended to be anti-Castro, and he met with Bringuer at Bringuer's store, Bringuer being an anti-Castro Cuban. But then Bringuer saw Oswald passing out pro-Castro leaflets, and the two had a fight, and Oswald got arrested and spent a night in jail. But nobody really goes anywhere with this story. The Bringuer story has been well known, but nobody says that just because Oswald was involved with Bringuer, that means that he was involved in a conspiracy. Same thing with this story. This story appears to go nowhere, just like Bringuer. Oswald expected to be in Cuba in a few days. Whether they drove him to Houston or he got there by his own means, he expected to be in Cuba. He might have thought to brag to Castro about fooling Leopoldo and maybe Bringuer. but he could not have joined forces with them to kill JFK on November 22nd. Why? Because he fully expected to be in Cuba. Even if Oswald spent a day with 2 Cubans, it would be like the afternoon he spent with Bringuier, with the exception of Odio's hearsay, twice removed. And so it does not appear to matter very much. Remember, the question is whether the Cubans joined with Oswald to kill JFK on November 22nd, 1963. Either they discussed this possibility with him before he left for Mexico City, or they would have had to discuss this with him after he returned to Dallas. He did not know of a presidential motorcade in Dallas before he left for Mexico City that would give him an opportunity to fire a rifle. Again, he didn't even know he'd be working at the Texas School Book Depository building. He could not have discussed this before going to Cuba because he assumed he would be in Cuba. After he returned from Mexico on October 3rd, there is no evidence that Oswald was in communication with anyone outside his family or the Paines between October and November 22nd, 1963. Carlos Bringuier has been ignored by conspiracists because there is no there. There's no reason to spotlight him. There's no evidence of conspiracy. But there is also no evidence of conspiracy in this case, even if Oswald was there. So in the end, this is a story that is fascinating, especially because it has never been conclusively disproven. But you can't always prove a negative. And so we always have to keep that in mind. It hasn't been proven either. And so for 2 reasons, I think our best response to the Odio story is really to take heed of it, show that we understand it, and then proceed to ignore it, because for 60 years it has gone nowhere. And does anyone think there could be any way or any reason it would go somewhere in the future if it has gone nowhere all this time? Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching.